There is a family you have almost certainly never heard of. They appear in only one chapter of the entire Bible. They hold no armies, no palaces, no thrones. They perform no miracles. They conquer no kingdoms. They are not royalty, not priests, not prophets. They are a clan of wanderers who live in tents, drink no wine, and plant no crops. And yet, in one of the most turbulent moments in the history of the ancient world, God points to them, a quiet, ordinary family, and says to an entire nation, look at them, learn from them. They understood something that you never could. This is the story of the Riquats. It is a story about obedience, about legacy, about what happens when a single ancestor makes a decision so profound that it echoes through generations long after that ancestor is dust and memory. It is a story about a world spinning toward collapse, about empires swallowing kingdoms whole, about a people who abandoned their God while that God watched, heartbroken from the heights of history. And in the middle of all of that ruin, in the middle of the fire, there is one family standing still, unmoved, faithful, uncompromising. They are not famous. They're not celebrated in stained glass or hymns. But heaven noticed them, and that, as you will discover, is the only kind of recognition that lasts. Settle in. Let the night grow quiet around you, because this story does not begin with thunder or miracles. It begins with a simple invitation in a room inside the temple, with a table set with wine, and with a family that looked at that table and said no. The world in crisis. Chapter 1. To understand the recites, you must first understand the world they lived in, because their obedience was not tested in easy times. It was tested in one of the most dangerous, disorienting, and morally exhausted periods in the history of ancient Judah. Their faithfulness did not grow in peaceful soil. It was forged in the middle of an empire's shadow, inside a nation that had largely forgotten what it meant to honor God. The year is somewhere around 600 years before the birth of Christ. The southern kingdom of Judah, the smaller surviving fragment of what was once the United Kingdom of Israel, is caught in a vice between two grinding powers, Egypt to the southwest, Babylon to the northeast. The great empire of Nebuchadnezzar is rising like a tide that has no intention of stopping, sweeping across the ancient Near East with terrifying efficiency, absorbing kingdom after kingdom into its vast administrative machine. Smaller nations face a brutal calculation: submit and survive, or resist and be destroyed. Judah is attempting to navigate this impossible geography with whatever resources it has left, which are not many. Decades of poor leadership, spiritual compromise, and political corruption have hollowed out the nation from the inside. The kingdom that once stretched from the borders of Egypt to the banks of the Euphrates under Solomon's reign is now a diminished, anxious territory clustered around its capital, Jerusalem, trying to remember what it once was while struggling to simply endure. King Jehoiakim sits on the throne during the events of Jeremiah 35. He is not remembered fondly by history. The prophet Jeremiah, who will live to see Jerusalem fall, describes his reign as a period of profound injustice and spiritual abandonment. Jehoiakim is a man who burns Jeremiah's scroll rather than hear its warnings. He builds expensive additions to his palace using forced labor while his people suffer. He collects taxes to pay tribute to Egypt, squeezing the poor to fund relationships with foreign powers. He is precisely the kind of leader who arrives when a nation has already decided that comfort matters more than integrity. Under Joachim's reign, the spiritual landscape of Judah has become something its founding ancestors would not recognize. The worship of foreign gods is not hidden or shameful. It has become embedded in the daily life of the nation. Altars to Baal stand in the high places outside the cities. Asher poles are planted throughout the land. The temple in Jerusalem, the house of God that Solomon built, the structure that took 7 years to complete and represented the heart of Israel's covenant identity, has become one place of worship among many rather than the only place. Idolatry has not conquered Judah all at once. It has done what it always does. It has crept in gradually, normalized slowly, accommodated incrementally until the lines between faithfulness and compromise no longer look like lines at all. This is the world that Jeremiah is called to speak into. And Jeremiah is not a comfortable prophet. He is one of the most emotionally raw, spiritually transparent figures in all of Scripture. A man who weeps over the very people he rebukes, who argues with God in the darkness of his despair, who carries the weight of a message that almost no one wants to hear. Well, he has been preaching for decades by the time of Jeremiah 35. He has warned, he has begged, he has described in language of extraordinary grief and beauty what the nation is walking toward if it does not turn. And Judah has largely ignored him. Into this context, this story of national abandonment, political desperation, and spiritual exhaustion, God does something unexpected. He does not send another warning. He does not commission another sermon. He does not call Jeremiah to the city gates to cry out once more into the indifferent noise of Jerusalem. He tells Jeremiah to invite a family to dinner, not a wealthy family, not a priestly family, not a family that anyone in the royal court would have recognized or respected, a clan of wanderers who live in tents, people who are in the language of their culture deliberately keeping themselves on the margins, not because they are poor, but because they have chosen simplicity as a spiritual discipline. People who have been following a set of ancestral instructions for so long that the instructions themselves have become part of who they are. Go to the house of the Rechabites, God tells Jeremiah, and bring them to the temple and offer them wine. It is an unusual assignment, and as you're about to discover, it is an assignment with extraordinary purpose. Who were the Rechabites? Chapter 2. Before we can understand what happens in the temple, we need to spend some time with this family to understand where they came from, what they believed, and why they lived the way they did. Because the Rechabites are not simply a clan of people who happen to abstain from wine. They are the living embodiment of a decision made by one man in one moment that shaped an entire lineage for generations. The Rechabites are named after their ancestor Ab, but the specific figure who gave them their defining instructions was his son Jonadab, also called Johannadab in some texts. Jonadab, son of Rechab, is not a major character in the biblical narrative, but he appears briefly in an earlier story that tells you everything you need to know about his convictions. In 2 Kings chapter 10, Jonadab encounters the warrior king Jehu, who is riding toward the city of Samaria to carry out judgment against the house of Ahab and the prophets of Baal. Jehu sees Jonadab on the road and stops. He asks him, "Is your heart right as my heart is with your heart?" And Jonadab says, "Yes." Jehu pulls him up into his chariot. The two of them ride together towards Samaria. This is a brief cameo, but it reveals something important about Jonadab. He's a man of strong convictions and clear alliances. He's not a man who tries to stay neutral. He aligns himself with the pursuit of righteousness, even when that pursuit is costly and controversial. He climbs into the chariot of a man carrying out bloody radical reform because he believes in what that man is doing. Jonadab is someone who, when he sees a line, crosses it deliberately and without apology. This same character, the character of the man who takes clear positions, who honors his convictions with action, eventually expresses itself in a set of instructions that Jonadab gives to his children. And we do not know exactly when these instructions were given or under what circumstances. The biblical text does not elaborate on the moment of their origin, but by the time of Jeremiah 35, which is likely more than 200 years after Jonadab's time, these instructions are still being followed precisely, completely without modification. The instructions were specific and demanding. Jonadab told his descendants, "You shall drink no wine, neither you nor your sons forever. You shall not build a house. You shall not sow seed. You shall not plant or have a vineyard. You shall dwell in tents all your days so that you may live many days in the land where you sojourn. Read those instructions slowly because each one of them is deliberate. No wine. Wine in the ancient Near East was not simply a beverage. It was embedded in culture, in celebration, in hospitality, in commerce, in religious ritual. Wine was everywhere. To abstain from wine was to constantly distinguish yourself from the culture around you, to mark yourself as different in the most ordinary social situations, at meals, at festivals, at gatherings. Every time someone offered the Rikerites a cup and they declined, they were making a statement. Not a loud statement, not an aggressive one, just a quiet, consistent declaration. We are not governed by the customs of the world around us. We are governed by something else. No permanent houses. This instruction is extraordinary when you consider what it means over time. Every human being across the centuries has known the pull toward permanence, toward building something that says, I was here. I belong here. This land is mine. Houses represent security. They represent investment. They represent the belief that the future is worth preparing for. To refuse to build a permanent house is to refuse to plant yourself in the world. It is to remain always in the posture of a sojourner, someone passing through, someone whose ultimate home is not made of stone and timber. No planting, no vineyards. Agriculture was the foundation of ancient economy. To not plant is to be deliberately dependent on God, on movement, on the provision that comes from a life that cannot be entirely controlled. The Requats could not hoard. They could not accumulate in the way that farmers accumulate. They had to live with a kind of structural trust built into their existence. Tense, always tense, not as poverty, but as philosophy. The tent is the symbol of the pilgrim. It is the dwelling of someone who knows that this is not their final destination. The Israelites wandered through the wilderness in tents. The ark of God was kept in a tent, the tabernacle, before the temple was built. To live in a tent is to identify yourself with a particular kind of spiritual posture. Mobile, unattached, dependent, temporary. Now hold all of that in your mind and then consider the most remarkable thing about these instructions. They were not given by God. They were given by a man. Jonadab, son of Rechab, was not a prophet. He was not a priest. He was not a king. He was a man who saw something, who saw where his world was heading perhaps, or who understood something deep about the corrupting effects of comfort and accumulation and settled ease. And he made a decision. He said to his children, and this is how we will live, not because the law requires it, not because a prophet commanded it, because I have seen what happens to people who drink too deeply from the cup of this world, and I want something different for you. And his children obeyed, and their children obeyed, and their children's children obeyed for more than 200 years across the full sweep of Judah's history. Through the reigns of good kings and bad ones, through periods of national renewal and national collapse, through times when the culture pressed in on every side, the Rechabites kept Jonadab's instructions. They were not alone when the events of Jeremiah 35 begin. The text mentions that the whole house of the Requats had come to Jerusalem to escape the advancing armies of Babylon and the allied forces of the Chaldeans and Arameans who were devastating the countryside. This detail is quietly important. The Requats, who lived in tents and moved freely through the land, had been forced by the violent chaos of their times to shelter inside a walled city. They are technically violating the spirit of their nomadic calling by being inside Jerusalem's walls, but not by choice. They are refugees within the city, waiting for the danger to pass so they can return to their wandering life. This is the family that Jeremiah is asked to invite into the temple. Jeremiah's strange assignment. Chapter 3. Picture the temple in Jerusalem. Not as it exists today, for it does not exist today, and having been destroyed by Babylon less than 2 decades after the events of Jeremiah 35. But as it stood then in the late reign of Jehoiakim, the great structure of limestone and cedar that Solomon built, and that had been the spiritual center of Israelite life for centuries. The outer courts where ordinary people came to offer sacrifices and prayers. The inner courts reserved for priests. The chambers built into the walls and rooms surrounding the main structure. Spaces used by temple officials, prophets, administrators, the various figures who moved through the sacred precincts of the house of God. Jeremiah brings the Rechabites into one of these chambers. The text specifies that it is the chamber of the sons of Han, son of Idaliah, a man of God. This is not an incidental detail. The location matters. And the requats are not brought into a marketplace or a government hall. They are brought into the temple itself, into a room that belongs to a prophetic figure, a man of God, which means they are standing in a sacred space in the presence of sacred intention under the eye of heaven. Jeremiah sets bowls and cups of wine before them. Think about what this moment looks like. There is the prophet, one of the most significant figures in Israel's spiritual history, a man whose words have been preserved and are being read thousands of years later. There is the family, multiple generations of them. The text implies fathers and sons. The whole household of the recites gathered together. And there is the wine arranged before them, an offering of hospitality, perhaps an opportunity, certainly. And Jeremiah says, drink wine. Now at first reading, this might seem strange. Why would God instruct Jeremiah to offer wine to people who don't drink wine? Is this a temptation? Is it a trap designed to expose their weakness? Is Jeremiah trying to catch them in a moment of compromise? No, this is not that kind of story. What Jeremiah is doing is creating a demonstration. He is staging a visual enacted parable, something the biblical prophets did regularly using physical actions and symbolic gestures to make spiritual truth concrete and undeniable. God is not testing the Rechabites to see if they will fail. God already knows what they will do. The entire point of this scene is the answer, not the question. The wine is on the table not because God hopes the requats will drink it, but because the refusal that follows will speak louder than any sermon. The observers in this moment, and whether they are Jeremiah's disciples, temple officials, or others who witness the scene, are about to see something. They are about to see what obedience actually looks like when it is not convenient, when there is no obvious external enforcement, when the person who gave the original instruction is long dead and cannot enforce anything, when the culture all around you has moved on and would not judge you for accepting the cup. The wine is on the table, the cups are ready, and Jeremiah waits. The refusal. Chapter 4. The Rechabites decline. They do not decline rudely. They do not make a scene. They do not lecture Jeremiah or perform their righteousness for an audience. They simply explain with evident calm and complete certainty why they cannot accept the wine he has offered them. We will drink no wine, they say, for Jonadab, the son of Reshab, our father commanded us. You shall not drink wine, neither you nor your sons forever. And then they go further. They do not simply cite the wine prohibition. They rehearse the entire body of Jonadab's instructions, as if to make absolutely clear that the wine is not an isolated rule, but part of a comprehensive way of life that they have adopted in full. They name the commandments one by one. No wine, no houses, no vineyard, no field, no seed, tents, movement, simplicity. And then they say something that carries enormous weight. They say, we have obeyed the voice of Jonadab, the son of Rechab, our father, in all that he commanded us all our days. We and our wives, our sons and our daughters, all our days, not most days, not in private, not when it was easy. All their days, the whole household, men and women, parents and children, the instruction of a dead ancestor has woven itself so completely into the identity of this family that it is no longer experienced as an external rule, but as an internal reality. This is simply who they are. This is simply how they live. The question of whether to drink the wine that Jeremiah has placed before them does not require deliberation or struggle. There is nothing to deliberate. The answer is the same as it has always been across every generation that came before them through every circumstance and pressure and temptation that the world has offered. Number. And notice the texture of that number. It is not angry. It is not self-righteous. It is not delivered with the sharp edge of someone who wants to make the person offering the wine feel ashamed. The recites are not performing their virtue. They are simply reporting the truth about themselves. They give Jeremiah a gracious, matter-of-fact explanation. They are not contemptuous of the wine or of those who drink it. They are simply people who do not drink wine. And they explain this the way anyone might explain a deep personal conviction, clearly without drama, without apology. There is something almost serene about it. And then they add one more thing. They tell Jeremiah that they have been following these instructions all their days, even now when the armies of Babylon have forced them temporarily inside the walls of Jerusalem. Even in circumstances that could have provided a perfectly reasonable justification for bending the rules, even when the original purpose of living in tents, the freedom to move through the land is temporarily impossible because of armed conflict in the countryside. They have not used the crisis as an excuse. They have not said the times have changed. The pressure is extraordinary. Surely Jonadab would understand if we adapted. They have simply continued to be what they have always been inside whatever circumstances life has placed them in. This is the moment the demonstration has been building toward. This is the moment God has been waiting for Jeremiah to create. The lesson is ready to be spoken. God reveals the lesson. Chapter 5. The word of God comes to Jeremiah in the wake of the requate's refusal. And what God says in that moment is one of the most piercing comparisons in all of prophetic literature. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, I go and say to the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, will you not receive instruction and listen to my words? Declares the Lord. The command to Israel was not obey this dead ancestors' traditions. The command to Israel was obey me, the living God who spoke from Sinai, who parted the sea, who fed them in the wilderness, who gave them the law written on stone by his own hand, who sent prophet after prophet to call them back. This God had been speaking to Judah for centuries, and Judah had refused, not because the instruction was unclear, not because the requirements were impossible, but because comfort was more appealing than obedience, because idols offered the illusion of control that the living God did not always provide, because the culture around them made compromise feel reasonable rather than catastrophic. And here are the Rechabites obeying a human command, the command of a man who has been dead for 200 years, with perfect, unbroken fidelity across every generation of their family, simply because their father told them to. The contrast is devastating. The sons of Jonab, the son of Reshab, God says through Jeremiah, have kept the command that their father gave them. But this people, meaning Judah, has not obeyed me. God does not present this comparison with detachment. There is something in the text that reads like grief, like the pain of a parent who has done everything to communicate love and received indifference in return. God is not simply pointing to the Raites as an intellectual argument or a rhetorical device. He is saying, look at what is possible. Look at what faithfulness can look like across generations. If a human ancestor can inspire this level of loyalty in his descendants, why cannot I, the God who made you, who redeemed you, who carried you through the wilderness and gave you this land? Why cannot I inspire even a fraction of the same? The Requats, without knowing it, have become a living sermon. They walked into the temple as a displaced family seeking shelter from advancing armies. They leave having been held up before heaven and earth as the standard of what generational faithfulness looks like. They are not held up as perfect. They are not held up as sinless. They're held up for one specific extraordinary quality. When Jonab told them to do something, they did it, and they kept doing it, and their children kept doing it. And that keeping, that faithful, unspectacular day after day keeping, It is what God is pointing to with something that resembles longing. I sent to you all my servants the prophets, God continues, sending them persistently saying, turn now, every one of you, from his evil way, and amend your deeds, and do not go after other gods to serve them. And then you shall dwell in the land that I gave to you and your fathers. But you did not incline your ear or listen to me persistently. The word carries such weight. God did not send one messenger. He sent many. He sent them repeatedly, urgently across the full span of Israel's history. Isaiah, Amos, Hosea, Micah, and before them many others whose names we do not even know. Every one of them saying the same essential thing. Come back, return. You're walking toward disaster and you do not have to. Come back. Judah did not come back. And now Babylon is coming. Judgment and promise. Chapter 6. The judgment that follows the temple scene is not delivered with satisfaction. There is nothing triumphant in Jeremiah's prophecy against Judah. If you read the book of Jeremiah in its fullness, not just this chapter, but the whole sweeping, anguished record of his ministry, you understand that he carries the coming catastrophe in his body like a wound. He is not the kind of prophet who enjoys saying, I told you so. He would give everything to be wrong. He would give everything to see Judah repent and watch God relent, as he had seen in the story of Nineveh and Jonah, that the repentance does not come, and so the judgment must be declared. Therefore, thus says the Lord, the God of hosts, the God of Israel, behold, I am bringing upon Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem all the disaster that I have pronounced against them, because I have spoken to them, and they have not listened. I have called to them, and they have not answered. The disaster Jeremiah pronounces is real, specific, and imminent. Babylon will come. The army of Nebuchadnezzar will surround Jerusalem. The siege will last long enough to produce famine inside the city walls. The temple, that great structure Solomon built, the house where God had placed his name, will be burned to the ground. The walls of Jerusalem will be broken down. The population will be carried away into exile across the desert to the rivers of Babylon, where they will sit down and weep when they remember Zion. All of this is coming, and it is coming. Jeremiah makes plain, not because God is cruel or because Babylon is righteous. It is coming because a nation that received extraordinary grace and was given extraordinary law chose over and over again to walk away from both. But then God turns to the Requats and his tone changes. To the house of the Requats, God says through Jeremiah, because you have obeyed the command of Jonadab your father and kept all his precepts and done all that he commanded you. Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, Jonadab, the son of Rehab, shall never lack a man to stand before me. Never lack a man to stand before me. This is the phrase that has resonated through centuries of reflection on this passage. To stand before God is a phrase associated with service, with proximity, with the honor of being in the divine presence. To have a continuous line of descendants who stand before God is one of the great covenantal promises in the Hebrew Scriptures. It is the kind of promise typically made to priests, to kings, to prophets, to figures of enormous spiritual significance. And here it is being given to a family of tent dwellers, a family of wanderers, a family that nobody in Joachim's court would have recognized or respected. The contrast with Judah in this moment is almost overwhelming. Judah, the covenant nation, the descendants of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the people to whom the law was given, the people for whom the temple was built. Judah is about to lose everything. Its king will be humiliated. Its city will be destroyed. Its people will be exiled. The temple will be ash. And the reshapes who asked for nothing, who performed no miracles, who wielded no power, who have simply been faithful to their ancestors' instructions in the privacy of their nomadic life. The recites receive a promise of eternal continuity in the presence of God. Heaven, it turns out, has been paying attention all along. The meaning of generational obedience. Chapter 7. There is a kind of faith that announces itself. It stands in public places and makes declarations. It performs visible acts of devotion and is recognized for them. It is the faith of kings and prophets and warriors and martyrs, figures whose stories fill the pages of history and scripture, whose courage changes the course of events. And then there is the faith of the recites. It does not announce itself. It does not stand in public places and make declarations. It performs no visible acts of devotion that would distinguish it from ordinary life. The Requats did not fast in the city streets or pray loudly in the temple courts. They lived in tents. They wandered through the land. They declined wine when it was offered. They planted no crops and built no houses and drank no wine and said very little about any of it. They simply kept living the way Jonadab told them to live. And they kept doing it long after Jonadab was dead. And they kept doing it when the culture all around them made no such demands. And they kept doing it when armies were gathering on the horizon and the future was uncertain. And a reasonable person might have decided that this was not the time to worry about old ancestral customs. They just kept doing it. And this, it turns out, is one of the most profound forms of faith the biblical text knows how to honor. What the story of the Ricky reveals about generational obedience is both challenging and deeply encouraging. It is challenging because it calls for a kind of faithfulness that is not glamorous. It does not call for a single dramatic moment of courage, the kind that makes for powerful testimony and memorable stories. It calls for the quieter, harder, less celebrated form of faithfulness. The faithfulness that shows up every single day in small decisions, in private moments, in the accumulated weight of 1,000 ordinary choices made consistently in the same direction. The retrobates did not obey Jonadab's instructions because they expected to be famous for it. There is no indication that they anticipated God would one day hold them up as an example to an entire nation. They kept the instructions because they were the instructions, because their father gave them, because that was who the Requats were. Their obedience was not performed for an audience. It was structural, built into the architecture of their daily existence, embedded in the habits and rhythms and choices that made up their lives. This is what the biblical text means by the word faithfulness in its deepest sense. Not the faithfulness that rises to great occasions, but the faithfulness that does not need an occasion to rise to because it has already become the texture of ordinary life. There is also something profound here about the power of a single ancestor's decision to shape the future. Jonadab, son of Reshab, has been dead for more than 200 years by the time the events of Jeremiah 35 unfold. He cannot see what his descendants are doing. He cannot encourage them or correct them or reward them for their obedience. He is entirely absent, and yet his instructions are alive. They are walking around in the bodies and habits and choices of his children's children's children. His decision to speak clearly and carefully about how his family should live has outlasted him by centuries. This is the extraordinary gift and responsibility of parents in every age. The decisions you make about how to live, the values you articulate and embody, the disciplines you practice and pass on, these do not die when you die. They continue. They either continue as living faithfulness, as they did in the house of Rechab, or they fade into irrelevance, or they are distorted and eventually abandoned. But they continue in some form. The question is not whether your life will influence the generations that come after you. The question is what kind of influence it will be. Jonadab made clear decisions and then trusted his children to live them out. He did not try to control them from beyond the grave with elaborate enforcement mechanisms. He simply said, "This is how we live, and here is why, and I'm asking you to continue it." And they did for generations because the instructions made sense, because the way of life they described had its own internal coherence and integrity, because living simply and wandering freely and abstaining from the corrupting influence of wine and the anchoring weight of permanent property had preserved in them a quality of spiritual alertness and dependence that made the instructions feel worth keeping. The Rechabites also demonstrate something important about the relationship between discipline and identity. Their ancestral commandments were not simply a list of things they were not allowed to do. They were the definition of who the Retroites were. To drink wine would not merely have broken a rule, it would have been a statement about who they were becoming. It would have been the beginning of a transformation away from the recite identity towards something else. This is why they refused Jeremiah's offer, not with tortured hesitation, but with simple clarity. The wine is not tempting to them because they are not the kind of people who drink wine. The identity is so deeply formed that the temptation does not have a natural point of entry. This is one of the great insights of the Rikwa story for any person of faith in any age. The most effective protection against the corrosive pressures of a culture that is moving away from God is not primarily a set of prohibitions. It is an identity. People who know deeply who they are do not need to resist temptation with great effort because the temptation does not feel like an opportunity. It feels like a contradiction. The Requats were not white-knuckling their way through Jeremiah's wine offering, gritting their teeth against desire. They were simply being themselves. And that kind of identity, as the story makes clear, can be formed and preserved across generations if someone in the first generation makes the decision to build it carefully, speak it clearly, and trust the God who watches over the quiet faithfulness of ordinary families. Faithfulness over popularity. Chapter 8. One of the most quietly radical things about the Rechabites is that they were not popular. They were not celebrated in their time. They were not praised in the royal court or honored in the temple ceremonies. They were a clan of wanderers living on the margins of a settled urbanizing society. People who by every external measure had chosen an inferior way of life. The world of ancient Judah in Jehoiakim's reign was moving in a very specific direction. It was moving toward settlement, toward urban life, toward agricultural wealth, toward the accumulation of property and the pleasures that property enables. The cultural pressure on everyone, including groups like the Requats, who existed on the fringes of that culture, was enormous. Success looked like a house. Success looked like a vineyard. Success looked like the ability to set a full table and pour a cup of wine for your guests. The Requats' way of life was not simply unusual. It was in the estimation of most of their contemporaries objectively inferior. And yet they were the ones God pointed to when he wanted to show Judah what faithfulness looked like. There is a lesson here that transcends the ancient Near Eastern context and speaks directly into the pressure every person of faith has ever felt in every age and culture. The pressure to conform, the pressure to normalize, the pressure to adjust your convictions to match the direction the world is moving. To tell yourself that the original instructions were meant for a different time in a different context and surely do not apply with the same force to the sophisticated, complex realities of the present. The Requats had been facing this pressure for 200 years. Every generation of their family had grown up surrounded by a culture that did not live the way they lived. Every generation had been implicitly or explicitly invited by the assumptions of their society, by the example of their neighbors, by the sheer weight of cultural normality, to simply be like everyone else, to put down roots, to build a house, to plant a vineyard, to drink the wine when it was offered. Every generation said no, not because they were legalists, not because they had never questioned the instructions, but because the instructions had become so woven into their identity that abandoning them would have meant abandoning themselves. And because on some deep level, they understood what their ancestor had understood, that the simplicity, the mobility, the abstinence from wine and property, and the settling weight of the world was protecting something precious in them. It was keeping them free. It was keeping them alert. It was keeping them oriented towards something beyond the accumulation and comfort and distraction that consumed everyone around them. The Retroites were not popular, but they were faithful. And in the calculus of the kingdom of God, as the story of Jeremiah 35 makes magnificently clear, those two things are not the same. Faithfulness over popularity is not a comfortable choice. It is not a choice that wins you friends or increases your social standing or makes your life easier. It is a choice that sets you apart quietly, persistently, perhaps invisibly to most of the people around you. As someone whose primary allegiance is not to the expectations of your culture, but to the commitments of your identity, the Retroites made that choice. And when the moment came that God needed an example, when the nation needed to see what obedience actually looked like in a body walking around in the world, there they were ready simply by virtue of having been themselves consistently across 200 years. The power of legacy. Chapter 9. Let us dwell for a moment on Jonab, son of Rechab, and what his story teaches about legacy. We do not know very much about Jonadab. He appears briefly in 2 Kings climbing into Jew's chariot. He gives his family their defining instructions, and then he disappears from the text. We do not know how he died. We do not know how many children he had. We do not know whether he was considered wise or unusual or even eccentric in his own time. And we do not know whether he expected his instructions to be followed for 200 years or whether he simply hoped they would last until the next generation. What we know is this: he made a decision about how his family would live, and that decision changed everything. The concept of legacy is something every human culture has grappled with. The desire to leave something behind, something that will outlast you, that will carry your name or your values or your vision forward into a future you will not see, is one of the deepest human drives. Kings build monuments. Artists create works. Writers compose books. Parents raise children. All of these are attempts to project something of yourself into the future, to ensure that your existence left some kind of mark on the world. But most discussions of legacy focus on the visible, the grand, the monumental. They focus on what can be pointed to and admired. The Rechabbet story points toward a different and more profound understanding of legacy. Legacy is the invisible transmission of a way of life. Jonadab did not build a monument. He did not write a book that would be preserved in the temple archives. He did not accomplish a military victory that would be celebrated in the historical annals. He gave his children instructions for how to live. He told them what to drink and not drink, where to sleep and not sleep, what to plant and not plant. He articulated a philosophy of life in the form of practical daily disciplines and said, "This is who we are." And 200 years later, God pointed to his descendants and said to an entire nation, "These people understood something you never could. That is legacy, the invisible kind, the kind that does not require stone or bronze to preserve it, the kind that lives in the habits and choices and convictions of people who may not even know the full story of why they live the way they live, who may have been taught the instructions so completely from childhood that the instructions feel less like rules than like nature, like the way water naturally flows downhill, like the way the requats naturally decline wine, not because of effort, but because of formation. There is a particular kind of grief in the comparison God draws in Jeremiah 35, the grief of seeing what was possible and recognizing that it was not chosen. God is looking at a nation that had received more than John ever gave his children. The Requites had the instructions of a good man. Judah had the law of God. And the Requats had the example of one faithful ancestor. Judah had Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Joshua, David, Solomon, and a centuries-long history of God's miraculous involvement in their story. The Requites had not seen the parting of the sea or the fire on Sinai. They had not eaten manna in the wilderness or watched the walls of Jericho fall, and yet they were more faithful than the people who had seen all of those things. The power of legacy, the Rechabite story suggests, does not lie in the greatness of what you give your children. It lies in the consistency with which you live what you believe and the clarity with which you pass it on. Jonab gave his children something simple. He gave it to them completely. He lived it himself and asked them to live it after him. And the living of it created something that 200 years of cultural pressure and political chaos and national spiritual decline could not erode. That is extraordinary. And it is available to ordinary people, to families who will never be famous, to parents who will never be celebrated, to anyone who is willing to decide what they believe, to live it faithfully, and to give it to the people who come after them. God notices quiet obedience. Chapter 10. There is a theme running through the Requa story that is easy to miss if you're looking for the dramatic. It is the theme of unwitnessed faithfulness, of obedience that happens when no one important is watching, that accumulates over years and decades and generations without recognition or reward, that exists simply because it is right and not because it is rewarded. And the Requats did not fast in public. They did not announce their abstinence from wine at social gatherings, making sure everyone understood how disciplined they were. They did not draw attention to their tent-dwelling lifestyle as a form of conspicuous piety. They simply lived quietly, consistently, out of the spotlight of their culture in the margins where wandering tent-dwellers live, when the respectable classes are building houses and planting vineyards and pouring wine. No one gave them awards for this. No one wrote songs about them. No national holiday was declared in honor of Jonadab's instructions. For more than 200 years, the Retroites were simply a clan of people that other people thought was a bit strange. People who wandered when everyone else settled, who abstained when everyone else indulged, who maintained the simplicity of an earlier, rougher way of life in an era of increasing sophistication and urbanization. And God noticed. This is one of the most comforting and clarifying things about the Requa story. Not comforting in the sense of comfortable, but comforting in the sense of reassuring. It reassures us that the invisible faithfulness is seen, that the choices you make in private, the convictions you maintain when there is no external reward for maintaining them, the long, slow work of keeping your commitments across decades. All of this is registered by someone. Jesus would say something similar centuries later. He would say that your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. He would commend the woman who gave 2 coins quietly while wealthy donors made a show of their large gifts. He would describe a kingdom that works like yeast in dough, invisible, unannounced, quietly transforming everything from the inside without drawing attention to itself. The Requats lived that kingdom parable before Jesus ever told it. They are the secret yeast, the hidden light, the quiet faithfulness that God saw clearly even when the whole apparatus of culture and power and religious authority was looking in another direction. And when the moment came, when God needed an example, when the nation needed to be confronted with the contrast between its failure and what faithfulness actually looked like, God did not go to the temple or the palace or the schools of the prophets. He went to a family of wanderers sheltering inside the city walls to avoid an advancing army. He went to the margins. He went to the people that the culture had overlooked. He brought them into the temple, the center, and held them up as the standard. Heaven's accounting, it turns out, is very different from the world's accounting. The world remembers kings. The world remembers battles. The world remembers the dates of empires and the names of dynasties and the great events that shift the course of civilizations. And these things matter in their way. They are real. They shape the material conditions of human life. But there is another accounting, a ledger kept by the God who formed the universe and calls the stars by name. And in that ledger, 200 years of quiet, consistent, unremarkable faithfulness by a family of tent dwellers counts for more than the thrones of kings who abandoned their covenant. This is what the Requa story wants you to carry with you when you leave it. Not a dramatic lesson or an overwhelming theological argument, just this simple, deep, sustaining truth. God sees the quiet obedience. God notices the small faithfulness. God's eye is on the family that says no to the wine when no one important is watching. And that seeing, that noticing, that divine attention, it is not passive. It is the kind of seeing that produces blessing, that keeps lineages alive, that plants a promise in the middle of judgment. Discipline as spiritual protection. Chapter 11. The Requat's lifestyle was at its core a system of boundaries, not arbitrary ones, not rules for the sake of rules, but carefully chosen constraints that protected specific things. Simplicity, mobility, independence from the intoxicating pull of a settled, comfortable, wine-soaked culture. It is worth pausing on each of those boundaries and asking what they were protecting against the prohibition on wine. In the ancient world, wine was not simply a beverage. It was embedded in the entire cultural and religious life of the surrounding nations. It was used in the worship of Baal. It was present at the festivals that blurred the line between celebration and excess. It loosened the tongue and quieted the conscience and made the night feel warmer and the compromises feel smaller. To abstain from wine was not merely a dietary choice. It was a declaration of separateness from a particular cultural ecosystem. It was saying there is a level of ease with this world's pleasures that I will not reach. There is an intoxication, not just physical, but spiritual that I will not allow to settle into me. The prohibition on permanent houses. Houses anchor you. They fill your attention and your energy and your prayers with the concerns of the settled life. The roof that needs repairing, the wall that needs rebuilding, the property boundary that needs defending. A house gives you things to protect, which means a house gives you things to lose, which means a house can become the center of your concern in a way that displaces God from that center. To live in a tent is to remain structurally unprotected by anything you have built yourself. It is to be dependent every night on something beyond your own construction. The prohibition on planting agriculture creates the illusion of control. When you plant a seed and tend a crop and bring in a harvest, you're participating in the rhythms of creation in a way that can make the world feel manageable, predictable yours. This is not wrong in itself, but it can quietly replace the posture of dependence with the posture of self-sufficiency. The sense that you have secured your own future through your own effort. The rabbits could not make that trade. They were structurally dependent on provision that came from beyond their own planning and labor. They had to trust, and trust practice consistently across a lifetime forms a certain kind of person. Someone whose first instinct in uncertainty is not anxiety, but faith, the nomadic life itself. To wander is to relinquish control. You do not know what the next day will bring. You cannot plan 10 seasons ahead. You carry only what you can carry. You settle only where you can settle. Your life is defined by movement rather than accumulation. When this kind of life produces a particular quality of attention, a capacity to remain present, to be alert, to hold things loosely, it is the opposite of the complacency that settles over a people who have become secure in their own arrangements. Taken together, these disciplines were not just rules. They were a spiritual immune system. They were the set of practices that had over generations protected the recites from the specific spiritual diseases that destroyed Judah. The diseases of idolatry, complacency, self-sufficiency, and the quiet erosion of dependence on God that comes when life becomes too comfortable and too controlled. This is what Jonab understood that Judah's leaders did not. That discipline is not the enemy of freedom. That boundaries are not prisons. That the constraints you choose can protect the things you value most. The quality of attention, the posture of dependence, the identity rooted in something beyond what the world can offer or take away. Judah had the law, Judah had the prophets, Judah had the temple and the priests, and the sacrifice system, and the whole elaborate structure designed to keep God at the center of national life. And Judah had abandoned all of it gradually, incrementally, because the cultural pressure to absorb the practices and priorities of the surrounding nations was more immediate and more persistent than the abstract call to maintain a covenant with an invisible God. The Requats had tents and the instructions of a dead man, and they were more spiritually protected than the inheritors of Sinai. The difference was not in the content of the instructions. It was in the willingness to be formed by them, or to let the disciplines do their work, to trust that the boundaries were not arbitrary but purposeful, to say, I do not fully understand everything Jonab had in mind when he gave us these instructions, but I have seen enough to know that the way of life they produce is worth preserving, and so I will preserve it. That is the kind of faith that builds spiritual immunity across generations. The Fall of Jerusalem, Chapter 12. The events of Jeremiah 35 do not take place in a vacuum. They are part of a much larger story that is moving with terrible momentum toward one of the most catastrophic moments in Israel's history. Within a few years of the temple scene with the Requats, everything changes. Nebuchadnezzar's army returns to Judah with decisive force. Jehoiakim dies under circumstances. The text leaves deliberately vague. Possibly killed, possibly dying during the siege, possibly surrendering and being taken captive and then executed. His son Jehoiakim reigns for 3 months before surrendering to Babylon and being carried into exile along with the royal family, the court officials, the craftsmen, the military leaders, the elite of the nation. Nebuchadnezzar installed Zedekiah as a vassal king. Zedekiah eventually rebels as Jeremiah had begged him not to. And in the 9th year of his reign, Babylon comes back. The siege of Jerusalem begins. It lasts 18 months. Inside the walls, the food runs out. People begin to starve. The Book of Lamentations describes scenes of devastating suffering, mothers boiling their own children for food, princes and elders sitting on the ground in silence, covered in dust. The city that David conquered, that Solomon beautified, that centuries of Israelite history had centered on, is consuming itself from within while the Babylonian army waits patiently outside. In the summer of 586 before Christ, the walls are breached. Zedekiah tries to flee at night through the gap between the walls, heading toward the Jordan Valley. The Babylonian army overtakes him. He's brought before Nebuchadnezzar at his command post in Riblah. His sons are executed in front of him. Then his eyes are put out. He's bound in chains and carried to Babylon. He will die there, imprisoned, blind, the last king of Judah. The temple is burned. The text in 2 Kings reports it with stark simplicity. They burned the house of God and broke down the wall of Jerusalem and burned all its palaces with fire and destroyed all its precious vessels. The bronze pillars that Solomon had cast, the bronze sea, the stands, the lampstand, all of it is broken apart and carried to Babylon as plunder. The house that Solomon spent 7 years building, the structure that represented Israel's covenant with God, the place where the Shekinah glory had once descended in a cloud so heavy that even the priest could not stand to minister. It becomes ash. The population is carried away. Some are executed, some are left behind. The poorest of the poor, the people so marginal that Babylon does not consider them worth the effort of deportation. The city that had been the heart of a nation becomes a ruin. Everything that Jeremiah had been warning about for decades has happened exactly as he said it would. And in the middle of this catastrophe, in the rubble of everything Judah had been, the promise to the Rechabites stands. They will never lack a man to stand before God. There are historical traditions that suggest the Requats survived and even thrived during the Babylonian period, that some of them may have served in temple roles after the return from exile, that their lineage continued in forms that later generations could trace. Whether those specific traditions are historically verifiable or not, the theological point is clear. The faithfulness that they demonstrated in the temple of Jeremiah's day is the kind of faithfulness that outlasts empires. Babylon falls to Persia. Persia falls to Greece. Greece falls to Rome. Rome falls to time. all of the great powers that dominated the ancient world, the ones that seemed so permanent, so overwhelming, so insurmountable in the moment of their strength, are now subjects for archaeologists and historians, studied by scholars and universities. Their emperors' names preserved only in textbooks. The Rechabites are still in the Bible, still being read, still being reflected on, still being held up by the God of that story as the example of what faithfulness looks like. When culture moves in every other direction, their tents are long folded, their wandering is finished, but their obedience echoes. The family that endured epilogue. You have been listening to the story of a family that no one in their own time considered important. They held no military command. They controlled no territory. They had no seat in the royal court, no voice in the national debates, no influence over the political decisions that would lead Judah toward catastrophe. They were wanderers with tents and an old man's instructions, sheltering inside the walls of a city because the countryside was too dangerous for the moment. They were ordinary people in every external sense in extraordinary times. And yet God noticed them. God pointed to them in the middle of a national crisis as the single most compelling example of faithfulness that he could find in all of Judah. Not among the priests, not among the Levites, not among the scholars who had devoted their lives to studying the law, not among the prophets' disciples who had sat at Jeremiah's feet learning the ways of the Spirit, among the tent dwellers, among the people who drank no wine and built no houses, and planted no crops and made no impression on the cultural landscape of their world. The recites teach us something essential about the nature of faithfulness, that it is not primarily about visibility. It is not about the grandeur of what you do or the audience before whom you do it. It is about the daily, quiet, consistent alignment of your choices with your convictions, sustained across time, passed on to the people who come after you, maintained even when the culture has moved in every other direction and no one around you is asking questions about why you live differently. The greatest testimony, the story suggests, is sometimes simply this: refusing to abandon what is right. Not with drama, not with heroic confrontation, not with public declarations or conspicuous sacrifice, just by continuing to be day after day who you said you would be. By teaching your children what you believe and watching them teach their children. By keeping the instructions not because you are forced to, but because you understand what they protect and you value what they protect, and you have decided that the cost of keeping them is worth it. History remembers kings. It remembers wars. It remembers the dates of empires and the names of dynasties and the battles that changed the course of civilizations. These things matter. They shape the world you live in. They deserve to be studied and remembered. But there is another kind of remembering. The recites were remembered where it matters most. Not in the annals of Judah's kings, not in the military records of the campaigns against Babylon. They were remembered in the words that God himself spoke through a prophet in a room inside the temple on a day when a man who would not be there to hear them said to a family, "Drink this wine." And they said, "No." And God said, "I have seen you. I have seen every generation of you keeping your father's instructions in the silence of the countryside while this nation collapsed around you. And I have seen the cups you declined, and the vineyards you refused to plant, and the houses you refused to build, and the tents you carried through the wilderness of this world. I have seen all of it in the line that never stops, the man who always stands before me, the family that refused to change. Hello, beloved friends. Before we begin tonight's journey into peaceful rest, I'd love to know where in the world you're joining from and what time it is in your corner of creation. The gentle voice of the shepherd reaches across all borders and time zones. If these stories bring you comfort and peace, please remember to subscribe to Sacred Rest for more scripture-inspired sleep journeys. Now let us quiet our minds and open our hearts as we listen for the voice of the Good Shepherd. In the quiet of this moment, I invite you to find a comfortable position. Perhaps you're already settled in bed, your head resting on your pillow, Or maybe you're preparing for rest after a long day. Wherever you are, however you've arrived at this moment, know that you are welcomed here with tenderness and care. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Feel the weight of your body surrendering to the support beneath you. Notice how your shoulders can soften, how your hands can rest without grasping, how your face can release any tension it's been holding. There's nothing you need to do right now except breathe and listen. Let's breathe together for a moment. Inhale slowly through your nose, feeling the cool air fill your lungs. Hold it gently for just a moment, and then exhale through your mouth, releasing anything that doesn't serve your peace. Inhale comfort. Exhale worry. Inhale divine peace. Exhale human striving. Inhale rest. Exhale burden. With each breath, you're creating space within yourself. Space for stillness, space for quiet, space for the gentle voice that calls you by name. I invite you now to begin visualizing a journey. As you continue breathing slowly and deeply, imagine yourself walking along a narrow country path. It's late afternoon, and the golden light of the setting sun bathes everything in a warm glow. The air is perfect, not too warm, not too cool, and carries a sweet scent of wildflowers and fresh grass. The path winds gently through rolling hills. With each step, you feel more of your daily concerns falling away. The emails waiting for responses, the conversations that left you wondering, the tasks still uncompleted. All of these can wait outside this peaceful moment. As you walk, you notice the sound of birdsong in the distance. Not the busy chattering songs of morning birds, but the gentle, settled sounds of evening. Soft calls that seem to whisper, "All is well, rest is coming." The path begins to crest a small hill, and as you reach the top, you see before you a wide meadow. The grass sways gently in a soft breeze, creating waves of movement like a green sea. Scattered throughout are wildflowers in gentle hues, pale yellows, soft whites, and tender purples. At the far edge of this meadow, you can just make out the stone walls of an ancient sheepfold, a place of gathering, a place of safety, a place of rest. This is where our journey is taking us tonight, to the sheepfold of the Good Shepherd. As you descend the hill toward the meadow, you feel a sense of being both completely free and completely held. The vast open sky above reminds you of boundless possibility, while the path beneath your feet assures you that you're being guided with each step. Your breathing continues to deepen. Your inhales become fuller. Your exhales become longer. Your mind begins to quiet like water settling after a storm. The path now leads you into the meadow itself. The grass reaches up past your ankles, brushing against you with feather-like touches. You can feel the earth beneath your feet, solid, supportive, ancient. As you walk, you begin to notice the sounds of sheep in the distance. Not loud or disturbing, but the gentle bleating that speaks of contentment and security. They're calling to one another as they make their way toward the sheepfold for the night. And then you hear something else. A voice low and warm, it carries across the meadow with remarkable clarity. It's not calling to you, not yet, but to the sheep. And you notice how they respond, turning their heads, adjusting their path, moving with purpose toward the voice. This is the voice of the shepherd calling his sheep to evening rest. Each one knows this voice intimately. Each one trusts this voice implicitly. Each one follows this voice instinctively. As you continue your walk through the meadow, drawn toward the sheepfold just as the sheep are drawn, you begin to feel a sense of recognition stirring within you. Something about this voice awakens a deep memory, not from yesterday or last year, but from the very foundation of your being. It's as if your soul remembers this voice from before time began. The path begins to widen as you near the sheepfold. The stone walls become clearer now. Smooth, weathered stones carefully placed one upon another by hands that understood the importance of creating sanctuary. These walls have stood through countless seasons, through rain and wind and snow and sun, remaining steadfast in their purpose, to protect, to shelter, to create a space of safety. As you draw nearer, you see the entrance to the sheepfold, a simple opening in the wall. There is no gate of wood or metal, for in this place, in this story, the shepherd himself serves as the gate. Nothing enters that is not first approved by him. Nothing threatens that is not first faced by him. The voice continues to call, naming each sheep individually, knowing each one's unique needs, tendencies, and nature. And as the sun begins to sink lower in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the meadow, you find yourself at the entrance to the sheepfold, ready to cross the threshold into deeper rest. As you stand at the entrance to the sheepfold, you pause to take in its simple beauty. The circular stone walls rise about 4 feet high, tall enough to keep the sheep secure, yet low enough that the shepherd can see over them to watch for any approach of danger. The stones themselves seem to hold stories, their surfaces marked by time and weather, yet their arrangement remains sturdy and true. The ground inside the sheepfold has been softened by the passage of countless sheep over many years. What might once have been rocky earth has become a cushioned, almost velvety surface, perfect for rest. In some areas, particularly along the inside edge of the wall, tufts of soft grass have grown, creating natural pillows for weary heads. You notice that while the day remains warm, there is a coolness gathered in the shadows of the walls, a reminder that night approaches, and with it the deeper rest that darkness brings. The air here carries a different quality, sheltered from the breeze that moves across the open meadow. It feels somehow more concentrated, more present. As you step inside, crossing the threshold where the shepherd stands watch, you feel a subtle shift in your awareness. The sounds of the wider world seem to soften. The concerns that normally occupy your thoughts recede further. Here within these ancient walls, existence becomes simpler. There is no need to navigate complex decisions or manage difficult relationships. There's only the present moment, the approaching night, and the protective presence of the shepherd. You find a place to sit against the wall where the last rays of sunlight still warm the stones. From here you can watch as the sheep continue to arrive, each responding to its name when called, each receiving a gentle touch from the shepherd as it passes by him into the fold. This is how it has been done for thousands of years in the hill country. This ancient rhythm of call and response, of leaving the wide pastures for the secure fold of trusting the one who leads and protects. Nothing about this scene would look unfamiliar to someone from centuries past. The relationship between shepherd and sheep transcends time, speaking to something essential about care and trust. In ancient times, you remember hearing shepherds would often combine their flocks during the day, allowing the sheep to graze together in larger numbers. But when evening came, each shepherd would call only to his own sheep, using distinctive sounds or words that only his flock recognized. Remarkably, the sheep would separate themselves, following only the voice they knew, never confused by the calls of other shepherds. As you observe this evening gathering, you notice the care with which the shepherd examines each sheep as it enters. His hands move gently over woolen skin, checking for injuries or thorns that might have been gathered during the day's wandering. For one sheep, he removes a small burr caught in the thick wool. For another, he applies a soothing balm to a minor scrape. None goes unnoticed. No discomfort goes unended. The sheep themselves seem to welcome this attention. Though some are clearly tired from the day's grazing, they pause willingly for the shepherd's examination. There is trust in their stillness, contentment in their patience. They know these hands. They know this voice. They know they are cared for individually, specifically, attentively. As the fold fills with more sheep, you notice the distinctive sounds they make, not the loud bleating of alarm, but the soft, low sounds of recognition and settlement. They are talking to each other and to the shepherd in their own language of belonging. The air begins to cool more noticeably as the sun touches the horizon. Long shadows stretch across the sheepfold, and the stone walls now provide not just security, but shelter from the light evening breeze. The shepherd moves among the gathered sheep, his presence clearly bringing them comfort. Some draw closer to him as he passes, seeking the reassurance of proximity. You watch as he kneels beside one sheep that seems particularly restless. He speaks softly to it, words you cannot quite hear from where you sit, but you can see the effect. The sheep's breathing slows, its movement still, its eyes close in what can only be described as surrender to care. This, you realize, is what true safety looks like. Not the absence of all threat, but the presence of one who is trustworthy enough to allow complete vulnerability. The sheep do not need to remain vigilant because the shepherd stays watchful. They do not need to worry about provision because the shepherd knows where the sweet water flows and the tender grass grows. They do not need to fear the darkness because the shepherd's sight penetrates what they cannot see. As twilight deepens into early evening, a profound quiet descends upon the sheepfold. The activities of the day, the walking, the grazing, the occasional startle running, have given way to stillness. Energy spent has prepared the way for deep restoration. The shepherd now sits at the entrance to the fold, his back against one of the stone walls, his staff across his lap. From this position, he can see both outward across the meadow and inward to the gathered flock. Nothing approaches without his knowledge. Nothing disturbs without his permission. In this ancient pattern, in this timeless scene, you feel your own breathing continuing to slow, your own thoughts continuing to quiet. The simple rightness of this place seeps into your awareness. The stone walls that have sheltered generations, the soft earth that welcomes rest, the attentive presence that makes vulnerability safe. As night begins to embrace the world outside the fold, you feel yourself drawn deeper into the peace of this sanctuary. The voice of the shepherd, which first called across the meadow, now speaks in the silence of complete trust. And though no words are spoken aloud, you understand with perfect clarity. You are known, you are seen, you are safe. As the night deepens around the sheepfold, the stars begin to appear overhead. First one, then another, then suddenly a multitude, transforming the darkness into a vast canvas of light. The shepherd remains at his post, a silhouette of watchful presence against the night sky. In this moment of perfect stillness, words from ancient scripture rise in your mind. Words that have brought comfort to countless souls through the centuries. The 10th chapter of John's Gospel, where Jesus describes himself as the Good Shepherd, speaks with particular resonance in this place of safety and rest. Listen now as the words flow gently into your consciousness. Very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. Pause and consider this image of the gate. In ancient sheepfolds like this one, the shepherd would often position himself in the opening of the wall, literally becoming the gate. Nothing could enter without passing by him first. No predator could threaten. No thief could steal. No sheep could wander away without encountering the shepherd's watchful presence. Imagine now what it means to have such protection. Not a cold barrier of wood or metal, but a living, attentive guardian who knows each one by name. This is not distant security, but intimate care. This is not impersonal safety, but relationship-based protection. The words continue to unfold. I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. Reflect on the difference between hired protection and devoted care. The difference is not in skill or strength, But in relationship and commitment, the Good Shepherd's connection to the sheep is not a transaction, but a bond. His protection flows not from duty, but from love. As you gaze across the sheepfold, you can see this truth embodied in the shepherd's posture. Alert but relaxed, vigilant but peaceful. His attention never wavers, yet it carries no tension. This is the watching that comes from love rather than obligation. The sacred text continues, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Imagine being known, fully known, and still loved without hesitation. Not the surface knowing of casual acquaintance, but the deep knowing that sees every fear, every hope, every quiet corner of your heart. The shepherd knows when you are afraid, when you are lonely, when you are in pain. He knows when you have wandered, when you have stumbled, when you have fallen, and still he calls your name with tenderness. This knowing is not one-directional. The sheep also know their shepherd. They recognize his voice among all others. They trust his guidance without question. They follow his leading with confidence because experience has taught them that he brings them to good places, to fresh water, to green pastures, to safe rest. As these words settle into your spirit, another passage emerges. My sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. There is a certainty in these words, a promise of security that transcends physical safety. The shepherd's care extends beyond the immediate dangers of wolves and thieves to the deeper threats of meaninglessness and separation. His protection covers not just the body, but the soul. His provision satisfies not just physical hunger, but spiritual longing. As you reflect on these words, you notice the sheep in the fold have arranged themselves in a pattern that seems both random and intentional. Some cluster together for warmth, others maintain a small space of separation. Some lie with their heads toward the center, others face the walls. Each has found the position that brings them comfort, yet all remain within the protective circle of the shepherd's care. Is this not a beautiful picture of community within security? Unity without uniformity. Each sheep is different in size, in age, and temperament, yet all are equally valued, equally protected, equally known by name. The night has fully embraced the world now. The meadow beyond the sheepfold lies invisible in darkness. But here within the circle of stone walls, there is no fear of what cannot be seen. The shepherd's presence transforms the night from a time of vulnerability to a season of rest. One more passage rises in your awareness. I have other sheep that are not of the sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. These words speak of expansion, of inclusion, of a circle of care that continues to widen. The shepherd's heart is not limited to those already gathered, but extends to those still wandering, still searching, still unsure of where they belong. As you let these ancient words settle deeply into your consciousness, you notice that the rhythm of your breathing is synchronized with the gentle rise and fall of the sleeping sheep around you. There is a harmony here, a natural community formed not by effortful connection, but by shared trust in the one who watches over all. The shepherd's eyes meet yours across the sheepfold, and in that glance, you understand you too are invited into the circle of care. You too are known by name. You too are welcome to rest under the watchflies of the one who never slumbers. As the night grows deeper, something remarkable happens. The scene around you begins to shift, not in a jarring way, but with the gentle transformation of a dream unfolding. The walls of the sheepfold seem to dissolve, and you find yourself no longer sitting against the stones, but standing in an open field just as dawn begins to break on the horizon. The sheep are rising from their rest, stretching and shaking the night stillness from their bodies. The shepherd moves among them, speaking softly to each one, calling names that sound like music in the morning air. He turns to you now, his eyes finding yours with a gaze that feels at once ancient and immediate. With a small gesture of his hand, he invites you to join him as he prepares to lead the flock to fresh pastures. You rise and move toward him, feeling neither rushed nor hesitant. There is a rightness to this moment, as if it has been waiting for you through all the days of your life. Come, he says, his voice both gentler and more compelling than you imagine. Walk with me a while. As the sheep begin to follow the shepherd out into the wider fields, you find yourself walking alongside him, not ahead, not behind, but beside, close enough to hear his breathing, to notice the deliberate placement of his feet on the earth, to feel the subtle movements of the air as he lifts his staff to guide the way. The morning unfolds around you in a symphony of sensory experiences. The earth beneath your feet feels solid yet yielding, supporting each step without resistance. The cool morning air carries the mingled scents of grass, wildflowers, and the earthy wool of the sheep. Light increases gradually as the sun climbs higher, illuminating the landscape in stages. First outlining the hills in gold, then filling the valleys with amber light, finally bathing everything in the clear radiance of full morning. You notice that the shepherd does not hurry. His pace is steady but unhurried, considerate of the youngest lambs and the oldest ewe. There is no sense of urgency, no anxiety about reaching a destination by a certain time. The journey itself holds as much importance as the arrival. The sheep need movement, the shepherd explains, seeming to read your thoughts. But they also need to feel secure in that movement. Too fast and they become anxious. Too slow and they begin to wander. The right pace creates both progress and peace. As you walk, you begin to notice how the sheep respond to the shepherd's voice. When he calls to one that has strayed too near a thorny thicket, it immediately adjusts its path. When he makes a particular clicking sound, the entire flock knows to pause and wait. When he sings a low melodic note, they gather more tightly together. They know my voice, he says simply, not just its sound, but its meaning. The path begins to ascend a gentle hill. As you climb, you notice how the shepherd positions himself, sometimes ahead to lead the way, sometimes behind to encourage those who lag, sometimes at the side to prevent wandering toward unseen dangers. The greatest deception, he comments, is the belief that freedom means absence of guidance. True freedom comes from trusting the one who sees what you cannot see. From the top of the hill, you can see the landscape spread out in all directions. To the east, where you've come from, the sheepfold stands solid and familiar. To the west, your direction of travel, a wide valley opens up, green with the new grass, dotted with the blue of morning flowers. To the north and south, other hills rise, creating a natural corridor for your journey. The shepherd pauses here, allowing the sheep to rest for a moment and take in the wider view. He stands slightly apart, his eyes scanning the horizon with attentive care. When you understand that he's looking for signs of danger, assessing weather patterns, planning the safest route forward. Every step we take has been imagined before we take it. He says again, responding to your unspoken thoughts. I walk these paths in my mind before I walk them with my feet. That is how I can lead with confidence even into new territories. As the journey resumes, you begin to notice the distinct personalities of the sheep around you. Some walk with the confidence of experience, staying close to the shepherd out of choice rather than fear. Others move with the uncertainty of youth, sometimes darting ahead, sometimes falling behind, requiring more of the shepherd's attention. One sheep in particular catches your notice, and slightly smaller than the others, with a slight limp that suggests an old injury. This one stays especially close to the shepherd, often walking directly beside him on the opposite side from where you walk. This one knows her need, the shepherd says, his voice warm with affection. She learned through difficulty what some never learn through ease. That proximity to me is better than independence for me. The sun is higher now, warming the air and bringing out the sweet scent of the crushed grass beneath your feet. The path descends into the valley where a small stream cuts through the field, creating a natural stopping place. The sheep move eagerly toward the water, their thirst evident in their quickened pace. The shepherd guides them to the calm part of the stream, where the water flows gently and the banks slope gradually. Here the sheep can drink without danger, refreshing themselves in the clear water. When you kneel beside the stream yourself, cupping your hands to bring the cool water to your lips, it tastes sweeter than any water you've known before, clean and life-giving. Rest here a while, the shepherd says, settling himself on a smooth rock nearby. The journey continues, but never without restoration along the way. As you sit by the stream watching the sheep drink and then begin to graze on the lush grass that grows along the banks, you feel a profound sense of being exactly where you are meant to be. There is no striving in this moment, no anxiety about what comes next, no regret about what came before. There is only the present reality of being on the path with the shepherd, moving at his pace, resting at his direction, continuing under his care. The soft sound of the stream, the gentle movements of the grazing sheep, the watchful presence of the shepherd, all combine to create a sense of security so deep that you feel your entire being relaxing into it. This is what it means to be truly led, truly guided, truly known. As the sun reaches its zenith, bathing the valley in golden light, you close your eyes for a moment, allowing the warmth to wash over you. In this perfect stillness, you hear the shepherd's voice once more, not speaking to the sheep now, but to you. The path continues beyond what you can see, but do not be anxious about what lies ahead. I have walked it already. I know every turn, every hill, every valley, and I will never lead you anywhere that I have not prepared for you. As the afternoon light begins to soften, casting longer shadows across the valley, you open your eyes to find the shepherd standing before you, his hand extended in invitation. Come, he says simply. There is something I want to show you before the day ends. You rise and follow him, noticing that the sheep have settled into a gentle rhythm of grazing. They seem content to remain in this lush valley for now, secure in the knowledge that the shepherd remains near. He leads you to a small rise overlooking the stream, where a single tree offers dappled shade. Its branches spread wide, creating a natural canopy that filters the sunlight into patterns of golden shadow on the ground below. Sit with me here, he says, settling himself against the trunk of the tree. As you join him in the shade, you realize you can see the entire flock from this vantage point. Every sheep is visible, from the confident leaders to the hesitant followers, from the strong to the vulnerable. The shepherd's gaze moves over them with attentive care, missing nothing. Do you see how they graze without fear? He asks. They do not worry about predators or storms or scarcity. They have learned through experience that I provide what they need. I protect them from what would harm them. I guide them to places of abundance. You watch as the sheep move slowly through the grass, tapping to eat, occasionally looking up to confirm the shepherd's presence, then returning to their grazing with peaceful assurance. This is the gift I offer, the shepherd continues, not the absence of all danger, but the presence of constant care, not the elimination of all difficulty, but the assurance of never facing it alone. Particularly small lamb catches your attention. It must be one of the newest born to the flock. It stays close to its mother, occasionally frolicking in short bursts of energy before returning to her side. Its wool is especially white, almost luminous in the afternoon light. The youngest ones the shepherd observes, following your gaze, sometimes need to be carried. When the path grows steep or the day grows long, I lift them into my arms and bear their weight. They learn trust through being held. You consider this the image of the strong shepherd carrying the vulnerable lamb, not with impatience at his weakness, but with tenderness for its need. Do you know, he asks, turning to look directly at you, that I would leave the 99 to find the one? If a single sheep wanders away, becomes lost, falls into danger, I go after it. Not because it is more valuable than the others, but because each one is irreplaceable to me. Each one is known by name. Each one matters uniquely. The depth of commitment in his voice moves you deeply. This is not the impersonal care of a distant guardian, but the passionate attention of one who loves specifically, individually, completely. The Good Shepherd, he continues, lays down his life for the sheep, not because the sheep have earned such sacrifice, but because the shepherd's love makes them worth any cost. As he speaks these words, the light shifts, taking on the golden quality of late afternoon. The air grows still, as if the world itself is listening to this truth. Many voices will call to you, the shepherd says softly, some offering easier paths, some promising quicker rewards, some threatening what will happen if you don't follow them. But remember, my sheep know my voice. They recognize it among all others because they have spent time listening. Quote, because they have experienced its reliability, because they have found that following it always leads to life. He reaches out and places his hand on your shoulder, the weight of it both grounding and reassuring. You're not alone in the fields of this world. He says, even when you cannot see me, I am watching. Even when you cannot hear me clearly, I am speaking. Even when you wander, I am seeking. This is the promise I make to each one who belongs to me. You will never be forgotten, never be abandoned, never be left without guidance. The sun is beginning its descent toward the horizon now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Soon it will be time to lead the sheep back to the safety of the fold for the night. Trust and rest, the shepherd says, his voice a gentle command. These are the twins of peace. Trust that I know the way forward. Rest in the knowledge that you are watched over. Together they create a quiet heart, even in the midst of a noisy world. As these words settle into your spirit, you notice that your breathing has slowed to match the shepherd's. Deep, unhurried breaths that seem to draw peace directly from the air around you. Your body feels heavy with relaxation, as if every muscle has decided at once to release its tension. The voice of love is always near, the shepherd murmurs, his words becoming almost musical in their rhythm, calling you by name, inviting you to follow, promising presence through every valley and on every mountaintop. The sheep are beginning to gather more closely now, sensing the approaching evening. Their movements become slower, their grazing more intermittent. They're preparing for the journey back to the fold. Step by step, you are led to peace, the shepherd continues, his voice growing softer. Not in great leaps or sudden flights, but in the patient unfolding of a path walked in trust. Each day has its portion of guidance. Each moment carries its own light. He rises now, stretching his arms wide as if to embrace the entire flock at once. The setting sun behind him creates a halo effect, illuminating his outline with golden light. It is time to return to the fold, he says, extending his hand to help you rise. The day's journey concludes, but the care never ends. Through the night, I watch. Through the darkness, I guard. When morning comes again, we continue the path together. As you stand, you feel a profound sense of renewal, as if the simple act of walking with the shepherd, listening to his voice, observing his care for the sheep, has restored something essential within you. The worries that had weighed on your mind seem distant now, replaced by a calm certainty that you are known, you're valued, you are guided. The shepherd lifts his voice in a distinctive call that immediately draws the attention of every sheep. They respond with remarkable unity, moving toward him from all directions, gathering into a more cohesive group for the journey home. This is how it has always been, he explains as you begin to walk beside him, the flock following behind. The sheep scattered in feeding, gathered in traveling, diverse in their individual needs, united in their common trust, each one unique yet part of a greater whole. The path back to the sheepfold seems somehow shorter than the journey out, as if the familiarity of returning home compresses distance itself. The evening light casts long shadows ahead of you, leading the way toward rest. "You're safe," the shepherd says, his voice now barely above a whisper. "You're loved. You're guided." These words repeat like a gentle refrain as you walk, matching the rhythm of your steps, synchronizing with your heartbeat. They're not just sounds, but promises, not just comfort, but truth. They sink deeply into your consciousness, creating a foundation of peace that feels both new and somehow always known. As the sheepfold comes into view, its stone walls glowing with the last light of day, you feel a sense of completion. Not the end of a gory, but the closing of a circle that will open again with the dawn. The shepherd leads the flock through the entrance, counting each one, greeting each by name, ensuring that all who went out have returned safely. When the last sheep has entered the fold, the shepherd takes his place at the gateway, his staff across his knees, his gaze moving between the gathered flock and the darkening landscape beyond. He is the living gate, the constant guardian, the embodiment of care that does not slumber or sleep. "Rest now," he says to you, his eyes holding yours with gentle intensity. The shepherd knows your name. The shepherd calls you to rest. The voice of love is always near. As night embraces the world once more, as stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, you feel yourself surrounded by perfect peace, held in the care of the one who calls you by name, who leads you beside still waters, who restores your soul. In this sanctuary of trust, sleep comes not as escape, but as gift, not as absence, but as presence in the watchful love of the Good Shepherd. Thank you for joining me on this peaceful journey with the Good Shepherd. If these words have brought you comfort tonight, please consider subscribing to Quiet Stories of Faith for more scripture-inspired sleep stories.